Morning, ladies and gentlemen. As the judge just stated to you, opening statements is our chance to give you a roadmap. I know that this courtroom's a little wonky right now, so I'll probably wander back and forth, so please don't mind me over here. Now, I'll be honest with you, when I first get a new book, one of the first things I do is actually read the last few chapters of the book. It gives me an idea of where things are going to go. The ending is usually the most important part. It's usually the most exciting part. But what I've learned over the years is that that's a pretty bad practice to have, because without an understanding of the characters, of the plot, of what's happening beforehand, the ending really can be far different than what you're reading in black and white and what you see in front of you. Now, what you'll see in this case, ladies and gentlemen, is that this is really no different than some of those books. The ending that you may just see if you were presented that today is not what it seems. And what you'll hear during the testimony, during the evidence in this case, is that there's a lot of things you need to be aware of about what happened before Emily Noble went missing. What was happening and what people were doing while Emily Noble was missing, and what happened afterwards. Those details are extremely important in this case, and we ask you to focus on those details as you hear the evidence. What we expect you to hear during the presentation of the next 2 weeks, when you hear the evidence, the testimony, is that you'll see the ending in this case. You'll see that this is a very real case. This isn't a book, this is very real. And it'll be clear to you what happened to Emily Noble. Emily Noble was born on May 24th of 1968. You'll hear from friends, family, people that knew her, will describe you to her, that she was outdoorsy, that she liked to forage for plants and herbs in various forested areas. The exact place that you went yesterday during your jury view, specifically, and I'll point that to you here in a second. You'll hear that she was outgoing and never met a stranger. You also hear that she was brave, and you'll hear ample testimony about Emily Noble's life. Now, you'll hear early on from some of the people most closely related that knew Emily the best. You'll hear from her sister that during this time period, where most of the facts and circumstances of this case will be, which is May 24th, May 25th, and May 26th, that was a special time period for both Emily and her sister. You'll find out through the testimony, and we expect you'll hear that today, that Emily and her sister were born 2 days apart, the 24th and the 26th. And so the 25th was the one date and time that they were the same age. And that was a special time for them and something that they seemingly celebrated almost every year. What you'll hear during the testimony in this case is, again, the experiences everyone had with Emily, and the one thing that I think will be prevalent is that she has undergone a large amount of tragedy in her life. And as you'll hear testimony, we expect you'll hear testimony that during all these trials and tribulations that Emily went through, she was brave, she persevered, and fought through. Now, we expect during the testimony that you'll hear evidence that Emily was previously married. The individual's name is Mark. You'll hear that at one point while they were married, Mark died in 2011, and that he committed suicide. What you'll hear is that, again, that happened in 2011, and we expect you'll hear testimony about how Emily dealt with that in her personal life, her friends and family that were around her at that time, and how she persevered through a very trying time in her life. We also expect that you'll hear testimony that both of Emily's parents died within a year of each other, in 2015 and 2016. And that, again, Emily, we expect you'll hear testimony, her reactions to that, what she did to work through those issues, what she did to work through that stress. And we expect to hear testimony from those individuals over the next 2 weeks. During that same time frame, Emily met the defendant, Matheau Moore. When Emily met Mr. Moore, he also had a son that he brought to that marriage, and that son's name is Joey. We expect to hear testimony a little bit about Joey over the next couple of weeks. What you'll hear is that during their marriage, up until 2018, that leading up to their marriage, that there was a relationship between Mr. Moore and Miss Noble and Mr. Moore, that they met each other, that they started a relationship. At that time, the defendant was living in Las Vegas, eventually came to Westerville, and that's where they lived in their condo at Abbey Cross. From that time period on, the two of them, as well as Joey, lived at that location, the location that you saw yesterday during your jury view. As I mentioned, you'll hear a little bit of testimony about their relationship during that time period, friends as well as family members that were around during that. Once the defendant was around, we expect you'll hear testimony from the witnesses over the next couple of weeks that some of those relationships that Emily had, long-standing relationships with friends, became strained, that they became less frequent. The more routine or even yearly get-togethers ceased happening, and that those relationships ceased to exist other than conversations occurring on the phone, text messages, but those yearly meetings and get-togethers that were so prevalent and important to many people became less frequent. We expect you'll hear that in 2019, tragedy struck Emily Noble once more. And that was when the son of the defendant, Joey, who was living there that Emily took a passion to, committed suicide as well. Now, what's important to note, and I expect the testimony that you'll hear over the next 2 weeks will demonstrate to you, is that Emily was proactive when these issues occurred in her life. She sought therapy, she talked to others. During this time period, after Joey committed suicide in 2019, we expect that you'll hear testimony that she took time off of work to be at home with the defendant, to work through what had just happened in their life, to seek therapy. And that towards the end of 2019, after doing those things, after being proactive, she continued to persevere and went back to work. Now, we also expect you'll hear testimony that leading up to that, and then going now into 2020, that Emily was making real changes in her life. She was changing her lifestyle, her diet, trying to be more physically fit, those types of things that she's been working through over the course of the years, and that she was making serious changes in her life and seemingly was in a good place based on individuals that were around her, speaking with her, and talking with her. Now, ladies and gentlemen, that's information we expect you'll hear over the next 2 weeks, and I think that is of paramount importance to understand the background and what is occurring prior to the disappearance of Emily Noble. And we expect that you'll hear ample testimony of that over the next 2 weeks. But ladies and gentlemen, you'll also hear testimony about May 24th, 2020, and May 25th of 2020. And that is the last time Emily Noble was found alive. We expect you'll hear testimony that on the 24th, which of course, was her birthday. That she and the defendant went to a water spring in Bucktown, Ohio, which is about an hour and a half southeast of Columbus. That they had plans that day. Eventually went back to their home in Westerville, in the what's known as the Uptown Westerville area, which is the little downtown area where there are many stores, restaurants, places you could walk back and forth, walk into. You'll hear that the two of them went to a couple of different establishments. Old Bag of Nails, Cobley, Jimmy V's. Again, these are restaurants that are located in Uptown Westerville. And that roughly around the time period of 7 p.m., a little bit before, they were back at their home on Abbey Cross in Westerville, the place that you visited yesterday. You'll see throughout this trial there were a few pictures taken from that day, pictures of Ms. Noble with the defendant. And one thing that you'll note is that these are regular pictures, selfies. There's no injuries to the neck, face area, and that becomes important when we're looking at the timeline of events. And again, you'll hear testimony about this as we go through this case over the next 2 weeks. The next day, on May 25th of 2020, we expect you'll see evidence that it wasn't until 5:47 p.m. that the defendant made a phone call to one of Emily's friends to say she was missing. It wasn't then until 5:54 p.m. that the Westerville Police Department was first notified that Miss Noble had seemingly disappeared and vanished out of sight. What we'll ask you to do is focus on the timeline of events, and you'll hear testimony over the next 2 weeks. You'll hear and see a body camera from one of the officers today that originally came out to the scene and spoke to Mr. Moore. Expect that during that testimony you hear evidence that Mr. Moore was awake, according to his words, as early as 10 a.m. Again, as early as 10 a.m., the phone call made with the friend was at 5:47 p.m. We expect that you'll hear his story initially. That the two of them had came back to their house, slept together in the bedroom. That he woke up at some point at 1:30 in the morning, went and slept in another room, and then when he woke up, she was gone. Now, ladies and gentlemen, you'll see pictures of the house. You'll hear the statements made by Mr. Moore at the time, and what you'll find out during the testimony is that not only had Emily apparently disappeared, according to the defendant's own statement, but that was done without a note. You'll find out that she didn't tell anyone she was leaving. Her phone was left behind. Her ID was left behind. Her wallet was still at the house. Her car was still at the house. And that she seemingly disappeared after making the bed that morning. You also hear testimony that leading up to that weekend, Ms. Noble made a dentist appointment for the following week. And that was not canceled. We also expect you'll hear testimony that nothing had changed with her employment, and seemingly everything was normal. What you'll hear during the testimony, during the body cam, as well as testimony from officers and detectives from the Westerville Police Department, is that the defendant's statements jump around. The timeline is unclear, his own timeline. Where individuals were is unclear. And that seemingly statements are made initially to control the situation. We expect you'll hear testimony of that today. Shortly after actually that day as well as going forward. You'll hear from numerous individuals that were part of the search process to find Emily Noble. We expect you'll hear through the testimony that individuals that were part of that search process may have never even met the defendant. Some of them had met him one time when they initially went and got flyers very early on in the investigation or when the disappearance first happened, but otherwise didn't see or even meet the defendant while these searches occurred for almost 4 months. You'll hear about these searches that police were involved, friends were involved, people that had never met Emily were involved because they wanted to do their part to help. They were searching close by, further away, woods, water, basically any area that they could think of. We also expect that you'll hear testimony over the next 2 weeks of some cell phone forensics that were done on the cell phones, attempts by law enforcement to put a timeline of events together. And again, as we go through that evidence, you'll see, or we expect that you'll see, the discrepancies that are occurring during this time period, not only leading up to Emily's disappearance, but also the night in question on the 24th and the 25th. September 16th, 2020 is when you'll find out that the remains of Emily Noble were first located. What you'll hear is that 3 ladies, one of which knew Emily, one was the sister of that individual, and then a third person that had never met Emily in her life, were searching a wooded area that was nearby the condo. That after searches that had occurred for the better part of 3, almost 4 months at that time, resulted in not finding Miss Noble. That searches more close by started to occur again, in places that were thought to have been previously searched.
Turn the light off so they can see that.
Now, ladies and gentlemen, you went on a jury view yesterday, and what we expect the testimony will show, and I'm going to mark on the screen so that you have a chance to see where we're talking about. I put a red X on the location on Abbey Cross Lane. That's the location you first stopped at yesterday, the home of Emily Noble and the defendant. You'll see just to the west, there's another red line there. That little, what appears to be a street, is actually the bike path that you walked through yesterday. And then that wooded area to the west, that direction, is the wooded area that you'll hear about over the next 2 weeks. The area that Emily Noble was found was roughly in that area where I just placed the X there. Now, you'll hear testimony from the 3 individuals that found Emily, that they were walking down the bike path, walking in a westward direction. The woods became crowded. As you all witnessed firsthand yesterday, there's shrubs and trees and things all over the place, and it's not readily apparent how to even get through the wooded area. But we expect to hear testimony from the 3 individuals that as they were walking in a westward direction, eventually they found the remains of Emily Noble, found what they were looking for. You'll hear testimony that they called Westerville police, and at that time, Emily was finally found. You'll see pictures of the scene taken from BCI. You'll see pictures of Emily and how she's situated. And what you'll see is that she was in a kneeling position under a tree that was about almost 6.5 feet tall. and was found with a micro USB cord wrapped around her neck. Now, ladies and gentlemen, that wasn't the end of the investigation. And you'll hear testimony towards the tail end of these 2 weeks about the physical examinations that were then done, both on the scene as well as Emily Noble's remains. What we expect you'll hear during the testimony from the 2 experts from the state is that Emily had bilateral fractures of the hyoid bone, which is a bone further up in the neck area. And they'll describe to you and show you where that bone is located, where the fractures were located. But bilateral meaning one on each side. So pressure on both sides. We also expect during the testimony you'll hear there are bilateral fractures of the greater horns of the thyroid cartilage, which is roughly an inch or so under in the same neck structures where the hyoid bone would be. And again, you'll hear testimony from a couple of experts demonstrating where that area is located on a body. You'll hear that there was trauma to the left maxilla, the nasal bones, the left side of her face, up by her nose, top of her lip area. And what we expect you'll hear during the testimony is that these injuries that are described were all perimortem, or at or around the time of death, as opposed to healing fractures that occurred earlier in time, or items that are, or injuries that would have occurred after death. And we expect you'll hear testimony in that regard from many witnesses over the next 2 weeks, those experts. Specifically of those experts, we expect towards the tail end of our case that you'll hear from Dr. Smock. And during his testimony, he'll go through with you his experience, his background, his education, and we expect that his opinion will weigh heavy in this case. We expect during the testimony you'll hear from Dr. Smock that Emily Noble did not die of an incomplete hanging, that the scene itself was not consistent with the injuries he noted, and that his belief is based on the location, the bilateral fractures, that the cause of death of Emily Noble was a manual strangulation. And we expect you'll hear testimony based on his experiences dealing with these types of cases, his educational background, why you will be able to make that finding and demonstrate that to you. We also expect Dr. Smock will explain to you that based on the scene, based on the injuries, based on his opinion, this was a staged suicide, something that made it to look like a suicide. Again, if you read the end of that book and saw the pictures and saw Miss Noble the way she was, you may think one thing. But when you get a chance to hear about the characters and see the timeline of events and see the injuries and hear all this testimony, the ending is not what it seemed maybe at first glance, but it's far more complicated and far more real than that. Now, ladies and gentlemen, we expect that what you'll hear during the testimony as well is that Mr. Moore, from the beginning, was trying to control the situation. That he continued to stage this scene other than the physical scene that you saw or that you'll see occurred in those woods. And we expect that you'll hear during the testimony that Mr. Moore, the night of the 24th going into the early morning of the 25th, that very important time frame in this case, that between 1 and 4 in the morning, he's sending messages to friends, stating he's taking a sleeping pill and that's probably going to sleep in. Again, I believe the evidence will demonstrate that from the beginning, Mr. Moore is controlling the scene and trying to stage what eventually will be located in those woods. That becomes of paramount importance when we believe you'll hear testimony today of Mr. Moore and comparing Mr. Moore's original statements to law enforcement about when he woke up, roughly 10 or 11 a.m., and that that's inconsistent with some of the activity that occurred on his phone, demonstrating that he was awake far earlier than that, at 8:30 in the morning, and that he was awake even further in the earlier morning up until about 4 in the morning. So we expect that when you hear the testimony that there's a major discrepancy in the time frame. You'll hear part of that today when you hear the initial statements, as well as when looking at the cell phone forensics. Ladies and gentlemen, we expect you'll find out during the testimony that that's not all. That the defendant sent a text message to Emily just before noon on the 25th. Used the Find My iPhone app, which is an application designed to try to find where someone else's phone may be. And that he did that in around noon hour on the 25th, instead of leaving the room that he was laying in, instead of walking through the house to see if Miss Noble was there. And again, we expect you to hear testimony that it wasn't for at least 6 hours after that before Mr. Moore finally called someone and said, "My wife is missing." Ladies and gentlemen, you'll see body camera footage from Officer Hollis today. Again, Officer Hollis is the responding officer on the scene. He came, had the initial conversations with Matheau Moore. And we expect that you'll see during that body camera footage that there's a specific area noted in the back of the garage that after some period of time, almost 2 hours after the report, Mr. Moore points to and says, "This is weird. This cord doesn't belong here." And what we expect you'll see during the body camera footage is that there have been things moved during the pendency of when Officer Hollis originally first comes on scene to when the defendant points this area out. Following that conversation and during that conversation, you'll hear that Mr. Moore says, "This area is weird. I haven't touched it, but this seems out of place to me. Somebody must have done this." But what we expect you'll hear is that this is just another example of the defendant controlling the scene, staging the scene to make this look like something other than what it was. Now, ladies and gentlemen, after 2 weeks of testimony, you're going to hear evidence about cell phones, physical evidence. You're going to hear about the parties, everyone involved. And we ask you to be diligent in your review. Diligent in your review of the timeline, how things go together, and diligent when reviewing this case and discussing. And at the end of the 2 weeks, we're going to ask you to see this for exactly what this is. And we're going to ask you to make a finding of guilty of the charge of murder. Thank you.
Thank you. Please give your attention for counsel for the defense. You're welcome.
Would you mind keeping the lights at that level?
You just want the document.
Sure.